thank you so much for taking the time to join us during this busy RSA week. To put us in the framework of the problem that we are trying to solve today, I'm going to actually ask you to mentally step out of RSA week and put yourself into this mental framework, this world that's based on a true story. It is early 2022. You are in charge of... Good. Think we're good? Is that better? All right. So, to frame that again, it's early 2022. You are in charge of threat intelligence for your organization. And the topic that's on everyone's mind is what looks like an impending Russian invasion of Ukraine. It's a Tuesday morning, you're starting your day, and as you're trying to get ready for work, you start to get notifications about some news stories that are emerging. First of all, you get a story about financial and government services suffering outages in Ukraine. And there are rumors of a DDoS attack, but it's unclear what exactly is going on. Second, you get another story. Customers of banks in Ukraine are apparently getting text messages telling them that there are outages at ATMs. So it's unclear what's going on, but if this were true, then potentially it could mean people couldn't get their monies out of online banking and they couldn't get their money out of ATMs as well. And then you get another story. A partner of your company's in Ukraine had staff come into work and they couldn't start up their computers. They're telling you that it looks like there was some kind of wiper attack, although it's unclear what exactly is going on. So as you're thinking about this and trying to get ready to start your day, you get a message from your boss asking, what does this mean for threats to our organization, all this stuff that's going on? Shanyn and I have worked with many organizations over the past more than a decade around the world that are dealing with some kind of geopolitical or larger than cybersecurity crisis situation. And this type of question is one that we've seen asked over and over again. Whether it's a conflict like in that example, or the Olympics, or an election, the World Cup, any kind of larger than cyber event that gets the organization's attention often tends to prompt this question to their threat intelligence team. And the interesting thing about this question is there's not really one right answer. Because what this question is actually asking is what can we take from our knowledge of a geopolitical situation that isn't primarily based in cybersecurity, like Russian hostility towards Ukraine, and connect that through to specific security actions that my team needs to take, like prioritizing which vulnerabilities to patch first. And so in order to make those series of connections, what you actually have to do is explore a number of other questions, like what threats could potentially be related to this situation? And why are they associated with this situation? What exactly is the driving factor here? What could things look like if we saw a change in the threat environment for our organization? How can we start using that to prioritize specific security actions? And many other questions. And to add to that complication, usually teams don't just get to answer all those questions once. Usually there are a large number of stakeholders across the organization that a threat intelligence team is having to support that need to have those questions answered in different ways based on their unique missions. So again, in this mental framework, in this Tuesday in early 2022, as you're just trying to get to your desk and open your computer and start working, how are you going to respond to your boss's question? What does this mean for threats to our organization that there are all these events unfolding in Ukraine? And what are you going to tell all these stakeholders that you owe answers?
So throughout this talk, technical difficulties. We work in tech. Is this working? There we go. Test?
There you go.
There we go.
All right.
Good. Really killing this tech thing. I think throughout this talk, a lot of what John is going to talk about is how you can make sure that you're creating and crafting the right intelligence to help your organization secure itself. But what I'm going to talk about is ways to make sure that the organization doesn't fall into a really common trap, which is this sort of field of dreams mentality of if you build it, they will come, right? If you create the best intel, it will turn into the best actions and you're done with the mission, right? And that's not true. So we're going to talk through basically this formula for success that we developed as we were doing crisis management, which is delivering intelligence, but it doesn't end there. To the right people, at the right time, in the right format, with the right content, to help make the right decisions. And we're going to talk pretty tactically about a lot of these things and kind of pull back the curtain on how we do them. And hopefully everybody will kind of walk out with really concrete steps and concrete processes that you can build out in your own organizations.
All right, so to dive into that formula, the first question that teams that are supporting their organizations with threat intelligence around crisis situations run into is, what issues are even relevant to think about here? What kinds of threats or topics do I need to frame this situation to deal with for my organization? And we're going to explore that question in terms of where have we seen organizations achieve good, be able to provide some value, but potentially leave room for other value on the table, versus great. Where have we seen organizations really thoroughly address this need of determining, what are the topics that are at hand here and what issues do I need to address for my organization? So the first potential pitfall that causes organizations to get stuck at good instead of achieving great is thinking about this question in terms of what threat activity have we seen before. The last time there was some kind of leadership spin up about a cybersecurity event, these were the actors that were relevant, these were the specific types of threats that were relevant, and so we're going to say, hey, we could see the same type of thing again in this situation. And the problem with that approach, of course, is that it misses the possibility that the organization really sees something unprecedented or is dealing with a situation that is unique from the last one that the team saw. If you're a financial institution, you might not expect that every day you would both have a significant disruption of your online services and all your customers would receive text messages that your ATM services were down. That's not a common occurrence. And while it isn't possible to foresee every event like that, it's helpful to, in that example, not get hung up on what do we typically see when there's some kind of geopolitical concern, and let that be the way to frame what threats are relevant to think about. The second pitfall that we see organizations getting hung up on for, again, getting stuck at good versus achieving great is thinking in terms of what new threat activity is happening. What are the changes? And you might see updates like, hey, we haven't seen anything new, so we don't believe that there's anything significant going on here. And of course, the problem with that is it assumes that the organization's security posture is already flawless against the way that the threat environment already was. But what if threat actors were preparing for the situation? What if somebody got started working on it in advance on the adversary side? In the example of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, one of the notable breaches that we saw, an actor came back and exploited a foothold that they had established in the organization about 3 years earlier. So if a team was just thinking in terms of what are the changes that we're seeing to the environment, they might not be thinking along the lines that would allow them to catch something like this, like what are the techniques used by the actors that could be involved in this situation. And the third trap that we've seen organizations get hung up on is thinking in terms of what threats have some kind of explicit link to the situation. And really where we see this often happening is when a team's default in dealing with a crisis situation is to think in terms of keywords or explicit mentions is often where we see this type of hang-up. In this example, around the beginning of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we saw some threat activity targeting journalists that were based out of the UK. And so you might think, not something that has any explicit links to this situation. And this is an example of a lore that they used. But as we dug into the activity, we found out that those individuals were actually focusing on covering the emerging conflict, and the activity was tied to a group that we suspected of connections to Russia. So if you were an organization that was trying to understand, hey, what kinds of intrusion tactics could we see tied to this emerging situation, it's certainly something that's relevant to consider. But if you were just thinking in terms of what threats have some kind of explicit link to the situation, it might get missed. So again, none of these outcomes are terrible. In all cases, teams are in the situations that we've mentioned here thinking about some relevant threats to the organization and providing some value. But how can you really holistically think about how can I surface any issue that's important for my organization to consider in securing itself in this situation? And that great status basically looks like this, starting from the framework of if we were to experience threat activity associated with this event, what could it be? And looking at surfacing questions like what objectives would some actor have some motivation to accomplish in this situation. And a way that organizations can answer that is looking at, for example, what patterns have we seen in other similar situations, similar geopolitical drivers or other similarities that did not impact us? What patterns can we learn from there? Or what actors would be motivated potentially to engage in this situation? But overall, this starting point, if we were to experience threat activity associated with this event, what could it be? And looking at it holistically from that perspective is a way that we've seen that teams have avoided those shortfalls that I just mentioned.
So the next part of this formula really talks about to the right people, right? And I think one thing to really keep in mind anytime we're talking about intelligence is that intelligence isn't written just for the sake of writing interesting reports, right? It has to lead to some sort of action. And the people who are responsible for taking that action are the stakeholders. So as much as John was talking about having to kind of get in the mind of the threat actor to understand how they might come after you, it's equally important to get into the mind of the stakeholders who need to then turn that intelligence into action. Because if you don't know that up front, you're not going to be able to give them the right intelligence, right? So we work with organizations to help them conduct something called stakeholder analysis. And essentially that is getting a good understanding of your stakeholders' use cases. What are the decisions they're trying to make? What are the uncertainties that they're dealing with? What is the full range of actions that they can take with the intelligence that you're providing? Again, to kind of reverse engineer how you want to take the intelligence that's being created by the intel team in response to how an actor might come after us, but presenting it in a way and giving the right information so that stakeholders will actually turn it into action. A lot of organizations have not gone through this exercise of stakeholder analysis. It should be a dedicated work stream. It should be something that's constantly ongoing, constantly revised, constantly updated in a very iterative process. But for organizations that haven't done that, there is a way to kind of do what we call stakeholder analysis on the fly. And it's really just 7 questions, right? It's who needs to know this? What do they need to know? Why do they need to know? In other words, what are their intelligence requirements? How may they respond with their analysis? What actions might they take? When do they need a response? Is this something that you need to call everybody in the middle of the night and get them out of bed, or can this wait? Where should we send their response? And another good way to kind of back yourself into the content you're providing is what should we avoid including? And I really want to pull this slide back out again because I think a lot of times organizations think of their stakeholders as being the SOC, they think of it as being the folks who are doing IR and the folks who are doing sort of compliance and risk. But it's a lot more than that. Pretty much anybody in the organization can benefit from intelligence to help reduce that uncertainty and help them make decisions faster. It's just a matter of mapping all of that out and knowing who they are, what they need to do, and doing that sort of stakeholder analysis on the fly. Now, depending on the size of your organization, it might not always be feasible to then directly communicate with each of these different teams, each of these different stakeholders, each of these different use cases, right? I think for us, Mandiant Google is a really good example. We're a big organization. I think a lot of governments are also serving other companies and other sort of local branches of government. For them, it's also not feasible to do this one-to-one, hey, we're going to create original intelligence products for all of these different teams, right? So the way that we did this to be able to manage crisis in a way that's very resource efficient and very time efficient is after we had gone through and done that stakeholder mapping, we sort of took all these different audiences and dropped them into buckets. And that's what you're looking at here, all these sort of different concentric circles. So when we were creating these communication buckets, we looked at things like use cases. What is their day-to-day like, right? What decisions are they making? What uncertainties are they dealing with? What infrastructure are they using to make sure that we don't try to split these comms across different, are they using GChat? Are they using Teams? Are they only on some Slack, right? How do we make sure that we can communicate once and get them all? What is their workflow? Are they using very different tools as a part of that, right? How do we make sure that we don't have to reinvent the wheel for each one of these folks? And then process and expectations. What are the processes that we can tap into that already exist and kind of merge ourselves into? The last thing we ever want to do is ask somebody to pull their heads up out of their workflow and then come over to this other platform or get spun up on this platform before we can communicate with you, because they're not going to do it, or they're not going to do it very long. They're going to, after a couple of weeks, they're going to forget to log into that thing because that's one element of a job that they're trying to do. It's probably not actually their normal day job. Because crisis doesn't happen every day, right? So we need to merge into their daily operations, their daily battle rhythm as much as we possibly can. So after kind of going through that exercise, and this is just an example, every organization will do this different, these are the buckets that we created. So the idea is every single audience in each of these different buckets gets a different level of intelligence, gets a different intelligence product to help them make those decisions. So that innermost circle is a steering committee, right? We as a crisis function are run by a steering committee. And the reason for that is if you think about it from a RACI perspective, you need folks who are accountable for the strategy of how you're going to manage this organization-wide crisis response. So you want to have folks at a very senior level across every team or every function in the organization, so you've got full buy-in, right? Beyond that innermost circle, and those are the folks who get access to the sensitive information. They get the TLP read or confidential information that John is going to talk about in a little bit. But beyond that, we have work stream leads, right? Again, from a RACI perspective, that's your R. Those are the folks who are taking that strategic direction and then executing on it. They need different information. They need more tactical. They need more operational information and intelligence to help them actually start executing. Beyond that, that's when we start to look at folks who are relevant to analysis. Those are all of the folks who are providing input. That's the collect function, but it's also the folks who need requirements. They need tasking. Where should we be focusing? Where should we be spending our effort? What is useful? What can we be providing to help our stakeholders kind of make those decisions, right? Those relevant to analysis folks, they haven't done the stakeholder analysis. They don't know. They need to be told, and it's going to be on a case-by-case basis. Beyond that, that's when we're looking company-wide, right? How do we make sure that every customer-facing person, every person who's a salesperson, every person in marketing, to make sure that they have access to the right information so when they get questions from customers or the general public, they're not caught flat-footed. They're not all trying to reinvent the same question, and they're not going back to the analysis team and poking them constantly and interrupting their work on it and saying, hey, we've got questions, can you answer them, right? We want to kind of create almost a shield, but really kind of documents and products that they can go to instead of the analysts themselves. But those documents are fed by the analysts, right? So it's very efficient. And then beyond that, that's when we talk about the general public. What do we want to put in blogs? What goes on the website? What's in a press release, right? And there's asterisks there because that's when we really start to work very closely with our comms folks and our media folks. So it really does have to be an all-of-organization sort of response. And this is a really good way to get there, is to bucket folks together. The next thing to consider is at the right time, right? So it's this question of how do we make sure we are reducing uncertainty very quickly with our audiences, right? Getting them the right information at the right time without just making them very tired of hearing from us. If we continually give them intelligence that does not need immediate action, if we wake them up in the middle of the night to give them something that they're not going to need to deal with until next week, they're pretty much going to stop answering our calls, right? So it is a very fine balance, and it really depends on the organization, what kind of, and the case at hand, right? What really constitutes that middle of the night phone call versus sort of a next week email. But there are kind of different structures you can build out to make that a little bit easier. So this is how we manage our sort of, our internal communications infrastructure. And the idea is that you want to, as much as possible, overlay it on processes and structures that already exist. So you really want to start building those processes and structures now when you're not in crisis so you can mobilize them when you do need them. So what we're looking at here, I'm going to see if I can use it. There we go. At the top, you see a bunch of different organizations. So you see the SIG, cyber espionage, cybercrime. These are all different analytic teams within the company. And then you think, we also have sort of media and comms up there, right? In this case, these folks are all, they're stakeholders of the crisis function. They should be receiving that information so they can action it, right? But in this case, this is also the collect function. They're the ones who are pushing information. Here's what we're seeing. Here's the questions we're getting. Here's some new malware we've observed, right? They're pushing all of this into this sort of centralized function. For us, it's the Mandiant Communications Center. For this function to then take all of that, aggregate it, analyze it, and then start pushing it out to those different audiences across different cadences. And so looking at the left-hand column, wrong button. Thank you. Looking at the left-hand column, you can see anytime we have a crisis, what we call internally a significant event, we have standard communications channels that have existed for years and years. They're weekly briefing series. They all look at things at a different angle, right? So these weekly briefing series will look at a topic from a strategic, operational, and tactical perspective. And audiences know these things exist. They know that this briefing is on their calendar. They're planning to attend. So you don't have to create a new layer. You don't have to create new work for them. You can meet that expectation that they already have and use that forum to present information at the right level that's not time sensitive, right? It continues to give them that situational awareness for actions that don't have to happen immediately. Beyond that, moving down, you can see that we have, clearly I need glasses. When it comes to the sort of ad hoc things that we need to spin up for that immediate response that's not already built in, we do things like stand-up calls, right, for those innermost circles of audience buckets, the steering committee, the work stream leads. Every morning or once a week, it's a 15-minute round robin. Hey, let's get everybody up to speed on what we saw overnight. Have you had these taskings? Where are they in process, right? All of that stuff gets aggregated together to kind of create a common operating picture, not only about the threat, but about the organizational response to that threat to make sure that there's no silos, there's no information gaps, everybody's moving together. Beyond that, we look at sort of situational email updates, right? Not everybody can attend those things. Not everybody consumes information the same way. There's sort of an old rule in marketing and comms that it takes 7 touches to get somebody to really retain a piece of information. So how do you make, and folks also consume information differently. Some folks learn really well from calls. Some folks need to read these things after, right? So it is our job, in order to make sure that folks are actually able to take that action and retain it, to give them information in a way that they can retain it and they can take it for action, and that we're hitting those 7 touches, right? And then beyond that, we sort of manage a lot of the cross-functional coordination, right? How do we make sure that the information that we're providing and the taskings that are set by the steering committee are actually being actioned on? When you have a lot of teams involved and they're all kind of pulling in different directions, how do we reorient them to all be moving in the same direction? That should kind of, all the requirements surrounding that and accountability for that needs to be centrally managed and tracked. And then if the accountability piece is missing, that's when we go to the work stream leads, and that's when you can involve that strategic sort of team. And so again, that's another really powerful reason to have that steering committee that is pulled from different parts of the organization. Because if parts of the organization are not participating the way that they should, well, their leader was involved in the decision to move in this direction, so they can manage that accountability portion of it. And then below that, we can look at things like, and you can see we have a whole separate column that comes into play about our marketing rapid response, right? So when we've been working internally, we're moving in the right direction, we're moving together collectively in the same direction, what do we now say publicly, right? And so that's when we really work closely and activate the comms and the marketing rapid response function so they can take the information that we're generating and share it publicly. And very crucially, the reason that this column exists separately and kind of starts up here is because when we're talking about resourcing these actions, early notification is critical. Even if it's a significant event that we don't necessarily know if we're going to put anything out publicly at all, we still need to tee them up. We need to tee every team up because they have resource challenges just like any other organization. They need to allocate folks to make sure that they have the bandwidth to do these things. So it seems like a lot of work to create all of these different intelligence products for all of these different audiences, but the real key to doing this efficiently and quickly is to create sort of this self-feeding ecosystem of information. So I'll kind of talk this through. What you see on the left, this is one example of sort of an email update that we send out weekly to executives to kind of give them the high level, right? What's going on both in a geopolitical sense, but also what about the cyber implications? What are we seeing? And we do it really, really fast. It's quick to the point because that's what we know what this audience likes, right? Executives, they're not going to give you more than 7 seconds of attention. They're scan readers. Most of your audience is scan readers. So long-form reports, specifically in this context, are not going to get you anywhere. They're going to read the executive summary and they're going to forget it and shove it aside because they've got other things they need to focus on, right? So this is an example, again, of one sort of output. How do we create that, right, without having to sit down and do the research and spend hours forming this, right? This should take minutes instead of half an hour or an hour. That's the power of this sort of back-end ecosystem. So what you see here is, I mentioned daily stand-up calls, right? That 15-minute round robin, what are we seeing, what are we doing? All of the information from that is pushed out into communications infrastructure. So essentially what we do is we start off by saying, how are we talking to each other? And how is it being recorded? And don't overthink it, right? Use something that you're already using in your organization. Teams infrastructure, Google Chat infrastructure, Spaces, whatever it might be, right? These things should feed each other. These are open to all of the workstream leads, all of the individuals who are getting information out, but they're also pushing information in. So it's a very crowdsourced model of what are we seeing? It's low confidence at times, but folks are very explicit about the fact that it is low confidence because it helps folks understand how to action it, right? These things feed each other. Everything that's pushed into the centralized infrastructure gets discussed on the daily stand-up. What are we going to do about it? The output and decisions made in the daily stand-up get pushed into the infrastructure. the two of those things together form this daily situation, the sitrep email, right? So we're not doing a whole lot of original work here. We're crowdsourcing most of it. Then we take and we add in what's the so what? What are the implications? Why does this matter, right? And we take that information and that gets converted into a daily slide. And this takes minutes again, right? So something we found was that all of our analysts, all of our customer-facing folks were on their own going into that communications infrastructure and creating their own slides. And when you have that happen, it's super inefficient, but at the same time, there's marginal drifts because everybody's kind of making their own assessments, right? And over time, that can lead to drastic differences in the message that one client is getting versus another. So we just kind of created more of a hub and spoke model and just made it for them, right? And they can give it directly to clients who are doing the same thing, briefing their senior leadership, pull the slide in, it's already made for them, it's got our branding on it, everybody wins. At the same time, the information from that daily email gets pushed into a common operating picture. This is absolutely crucial to making sure that you don't have a lot of inbound questions that are pulling people off the task, right? So as you create that common operating picture, that's where the marketing team can go. That's where the media team can go, and they can pull that directly, again, instead of having to tap the analysts. All of this information from the slides and the common operating picture then gets pushed out into that weekly briefing series, that bottom line up front, that strategic, operational, tactical briefing, right? And then the attendees for that not only get to hear the briefing so they can retain the information, but now we've got slide decks. Now everybody can use those slide decks in another hub and spoke model. So the idea here is that something that on its own, if you don't have this self-feeding ecosystem, could take weeks to create, is now down to a couple hours, right? And you're able to have a huge impact and get everybody moving into the same direction. Let's talk about format, right? Form is the message, message is the form. I already said if you provide a long form report to your executives, they're not gonna read it. So understanding as part of that stakeholder analysis, how do they like to consume information? Where do they like to consume information, and can we tie into that, right? Is there any sort of, how do we make sure we're not duplicating efforts or requiring them to step out of their workflow to kind of focus on what we're trying to tell them? Anytime we're doing these sort of different products, so they across the board, no matter what, need to include these elements. These are the kind of, and this is not just in the context of crisis, this is for any intelligence function as part of their daily operations, right? It needs to include good analytic tradecraft. And so I included this kind of as a checklist to make sure that no matter how you're communicating, you're doing these things, right? You're using your analyst expertise and knowledge. You're using those structured analytic techniques, those SATs, to make sure that you're not just putting a personal opinion out there, right? That it's been vetted, that you've had multiple analysts looking at it and reviewing these things. You're providing judgments, right? That those judgments are based on facts, that you're not just kind of, again, providing personal opinion, but you're being very transparent about how you got to an assessment. And if a lot of that assessment is based specifically in the context of crisis on information that is moving quickly, developments are changing, what we thought was true yesterday is not true today, people are basing decisions on this information, so you need to be transparent about where it came from. And then same thing, source reliability and credibility. Where did it come from? How much trust can we have in that information and the source that provided it? You don't want to not share this information to your stakeholders until you had a chance to go through the full analysis process and it's all high confidence, because again, it's a rapidly moving situation. Stakeholders need information right up front so they can start to make decisions rather than waiting for the full end of the Intel life cycle, right? And John is going to talk more about that. So this is an example of the right format, right? And this is, again, one way that we did it. We wanted to give you guys tools and examples so to kind of help you think how you want to implement this in your own organization. What you see here, this is sort of a readout of that daily stand-up with executives and the steering committee. On the left side, you see the team that provided the updates. And the reason we did that is that if folks have questions about the updates, they know where to go. We don't want to be answering every question. We're a relatively small team. We don't have the capacity for it. We don't have the bandwidth. We want to give transparency about where people can go if they have questions. So you can see on the right side, that's where you have just really quick bullet point to the right up front points to help folks kind of understand and consume the information quickly. Here's that example of that daily slide, right? Here's where we say, here's the situation update, here's the cyber activity update. Takes 2 seconds to read, 2 seconds to consume. You can really quickly insert it into your own presentations with your committees. But at the same time, if you want to dig deeper, it's there. It's all linked. We've done we've vetted the sources. We've pulled down reliable information, reliable sources. And you can keep going if you want to, but it's not required. And so I'll pass it back to John to start talking about the right content part of the formula.
All right. So at this point, we thought about, as we're looking at, how can you enable your threat intelligence team to succeed in these situations? We've looked at what kinds of issues are relevant to cover and how to surface that, who do we need to be talking to, when do we need to be talking to them, what kind of format. And we're now going to be looking at what's the right content to deliver to this audience. And I'm going to be talking about that from the perspective of 3 considerations. The first one is that the right content is going to be based on a deliberate assessment of who is my audience and what is their use case. And you'll see as we're going through this, that we're referencing considerations that are interwoven with what Shannon talked about already, and that's kind of by design. A lot of this is helping look at different angles on, am I providing the right value to my stakeholders? So in this simple example, a team said, what are kinds of intelligence that we can deliver, and how do those match up with my stakeholders' use cases? And what are some examples of what this could look like to help address that question of, am I not just providing something, but have I looked at, is this something that's going to line up with a specific use case that I need to support? Second consideration is that the right content is going to tell the audience what they need to do in their next action. For example, what they need to say in their next interaction. And to illustrate why this is important, the traffic light protocol is an information categorization system that basically says, how sensitive is this? When you're sharing information internally, can be anywhere from this is fine to release anywhere, including publicly outside of the organization, to much more restrictive, hey, this can only be shared within the group that is in the conversation right now. You can't repurpose this anywhere else internally. And that level is TLP red, traffic light red. And there's a real temptation, that we've seen when teams are really trying to quickly respond to a situation and figure out how can I provide value to someone who's demanding quick answers. There's a temptation to throw in the entire set of information at each of those levels of sensitivity and say, for example, hey, here's what's going on, and also here's some TLP red information, which basically translates to, we think this is interesting, but you can't actually use it for anything other than this conversation. And some stakeholders may appreciate that, for example, senior executives. But if you're trying to equip, say, a team that's going to, in their next interaction, go out and talk to the media or go out and talk to customers, then it may actually cause them more work than be helpful to them to put into their mind that additional thing that they have to process through, hey, here's some information that I can use, and here's some information that I can't. So again, the bottom line is the right content is going to tell the audience what to do in their next action, and that's a good test of, am I providing the right content? The third consideration is the right content includes the right components that are required to make those right decisions. So let's say, the example of one of your stakeholders is a hunting team, and they're looking for threats that might be undiscovered in the environment. And if that's the case, then what you want to do is not just give them something that's relevant to their mission, ideally, but you want your team to have been able to understand what are all the components that are required for this team to take action. If I give them, for example, some observables on a threat actor, do I also need to give them some other information based on how their mission works? Because that helps avoid a situation where your team really quickly works to provide some valuable insight to this stakeholder, but then before they can do anything with it, they have to stop and go somewhere else to check off another item on that checklist of having the right components. So this consideration also ties really closely into the next section that we're going to be looking at, which is enabling your stakeholders to make the right decisions. How do I enable my stakeholders to make the right decisions? Out of all of the areas that we're talking about today, this is going to be the one that is most tailored to your organization and where you have to enable your threat intelligence team to perform most specifically to your organization's needs, because every organization's needs in this area are going to be different. For example, if you have a fraud team, then that changes what you need to provide them to make the right decisions versus if your organization doesn't have a fraud team. So what's important to consider is, am I building a relevant decision enablement framework? Am I starting with a relevant decision enablement framework that's going to help me holistically think through, assuming that my organization's threat intelligence needs around a crisis are not going to look just like any other one organization's? Am I building a decision enablement framework that's going to let me surface what my organization's unique needs actually are and ensure that I'm addressing those? We're going to talk through a couple examples that are likely to work well across a lot of organizations for that surfacing exercise. The first of those is thinking in terms of what threat activity am I trying to help the organization prepare for, and where am I trying to help the organization take those actions to prepare, versus where am I helping the organization take actions to identify threat activity that's already happening, versus where am I enabling the organization to take action to stop threat activity that's happening. For example, to prepare for threat activity, your security leadership needs to be able to implement the right security controls. To identify threat activity, your security operations team needs to have good indicators of compromise with context associated to be able to flag the right things out of all the noise. To stop threat activity, your incident response team needs to understand how priority threat actors operate and what they can do to look for them once they've been identified. So just a couple examples, but this is a way that you can use that framework to surface, what are those right decisions that I need to enable. Another decision enablement framework that's going to be relevant to many organizations is, who do I need to help prioritize? Where does the organization need to prioritize what it is doing to respond to a virtually infinite threat landscape with limited resources? First, who do I need to inform and to enable to take action in the first place? Again, a couple examples here. The team that's responsible for managing vulnerabilities is always going generally to be dealing with more vulnerabilities than they could ever possibly patch. And so that would be an example of a function that needs help with prioritization. What do I focus my limited resources on for the most value? Whereas informing and enabling a team to take action in the first place could look, for example, like working with the hunting team and saying, what observables do I need to give them? What kind of starting point do I need to give them to be able to perform some meaningful search for potentially undiscovered threat activity in my environment? So again, another example of a framework that's going to be relevant to many organizations. This is a very simplified example of what it might look like to use one of those frameworks to surface relevant decisions that your team needs to enable across the organization. So in this case, the team that built out this notional example has said, hey, who are all the stakeholders that I know I'm on the hook to provide some value to? And they've done that on the left. And then they've said, what are the decisions that I need to enable those stakeholders to take? And what are some examples of relevant intelligence that I've found to be beneficial and received well by my stakeholders in the past? So again, an example of how you can apply those decision enablement frameworks to surface what are the decisions to enable across my organization. All right, to close out, what we're going to be doing is looking at all of the above from a slightly different angle. And that's going to be, what are the main takeaways that we've seen across everything that we just talked about in terms of pitfalls to avoid that we've most commonly observed, and steps that organizations can take to succeed across everything that we just discussed as well. So first of all, those if you were to take away a few most common pitfalls to avoid or shortcomings to avoid, what could those potentially look like? These are ones that we've seen come up again that have been challenges across many different organizations that we've worked with. The first of those is a threat intelligence team is often inclined to wait to talk to their stakeholders until they have some kind of confident answer. And the problem with that is that it generally is going to aggravate the churn rather than allowing the threat intelligence team to better manage it. In a situation like the story that we started off with, what your leadership wants to know, or what your head of incident response wants to know, or whoever is the stakeholder is what do we know right now, what don't we know, and what are we working on figuring out ultimately. So it's important to not give in to that temptation to wait to talk until we have answers, and to have a way thought out in advance to be able to provide meaningful value before the team has all the answers. The second common pitfall is providing detail over utility. Going back to that example that I mentioned involving the traffic light protocol, the content that's delivered to stakeholders needs to be optimized based on, am I enabling the stakeholders that I'm talking to take the next action that they need to take? And often that means actually limiting the amount of information that's disseminated to any particular audience in comparison to the overall body of knowledge that's available to the intelligence team on the situation. Third one, making the audience come to me. I like the way Shannon puts it that just because you build it doesn't mean that they'll come. You need to look for, if I'm trying to enable my executive audience, where can I actually connect with them in a way that they're going to meaningfully see the information? Versus if I'm trying to enable my patch management function, where am I going to connect with them in the way that they are actually going to see the information? And come to them and bring the information to that venue, and that be the way that you ensure that you're connecting with those stakeholders. Fourth, saying it once. Whether it's 7 times or 10 times or however many times, it's usually not one time. And so it's important to have a cadence thought through in advance of how can we have multiple touch points with any stakeholder that really needs to be enabled with the information that we're providing to make sure that there wasn't room for what we're delivering to fall through the cracks. And finally, assuming delivery is consumption. We've seen it be really easy for threat intelligence teams that are under a lot of pressure to measure consumption primarily in terms of things like the number of reports that they're delivering or other measurements of themselves. And that's important to do. It's important to understand what's the output that the team is delivering. But ultimately, what you want to get to is not that, but did I enable the folks that were receiving the intelligence that I was delivering to perform the right actions? And let that be the indicator of, is the intelligence that I provide being effectively consumed? Second, in short, it's helpful to start thinking forward to what are the situations that are going to or maybe have already triggered the need for this kind of crisis intelligence response for my organization. Whether it's geopolitical hostilities, whether it's an election, whether it's any of the examples that we have up on the screen, we've seen over and over again across many different organizations this same pattern of there's some geopolitical larger than crisis or larger than cyber crisis situation or pressing situation that causes the organization to say, what does this mean for threats to us? And a key takeaway would be start thinking forward to what are those situations going to look like, or what have they already looked like for my organization? And finally, over to Shannon.
Let's talk about what success looks like. How do you measure success? How do you measure return on investment? Because this does take resources and it does take time to do, right? So, and this is true for any sort of intelligence apparatus, even outside of crisis situations. So the one thing we want to do is define and measure against KPIs, those key performance indicators, right? What should those key performance indicators be? It should not be how many reports you've created. Please do not do that. Many organizations just look at the number of reports we've created this quarter. Garbage in, garbage out, right? If you're providing a lot of reports that nobody's reading, nobody's actioning, what impact are you actually having, right? So the better question and the better idea is to focus on the impact. How many intelligence questions are you answering? How many actions are you inspiring? And it's often very difficult to track these things, right? Because a lot of intel teams are in the position where they create intel reporting, they send it out into the ether, they never get feedback, so they don't know what that action is, right? In a lot of cases, these are the same organizations that have never done that stakeholder analysis exercise, because one byproduct of that stakeholder analysis exercise is you're talking to your stakeholders, you're giving face time to them, and you're creating a stronger relationship, which makes it a lot more likely that they're going to come back to you with questions, they're going to come back to you with feedback, because something else you've done is socialize the intelligence function. A lot of organizations, or a lot of stakeholders outside of Intel, don't know what they can ask you. They don't know what value you can provide, right? So as you're having these conversations, you're getting information, but you're also giving it, right? And that's how you can really get to this really good KPI of what is my impact. When you want to evaluate, am I seeing indications of stakeholder confidence? So the way that we knew that we had been successful is the next time that there was a potential cyber crisis, right? InfoSec Twitter was on fire, everybody was getting questions. We hadn't taken action at that point. People came to us and said, hey, come on, I need something. Give me my slides, give me my information. Where's the infrastructure? Get going on this, right? We knew that people were confident, that they were starting to rely on us, and that was a really good indication that we need to continue and meet that expectation and continue to build that trust. And then another thing is to evaluate, am I creating that self-sustaining ecosystem? So look at how much time you're taking. What's your time from that stand-up call to that email product that you're able to put out? How many hours are you spending on it? How much resourcing do you need? And can you shrink that down by creating that ecosystem so you can continue to scale out and really be lean and agile? And I think at the end of the day, this formula that we outlined at the beginning is really a checklist for success, right? How do you make sure you are delivering intel to the right people at the right time, in the right format, with the right content to help make the right decisions? But I think for me, what was really helpful, again, in making sure that we were successful, is always remembering that at the end of the day, we don't want to myopically focus on the fact that we are there to secure the network and to help protect an organization from threats, right? Organizations are designed, the goal and the mission of organizations always has to be to serve people. We are service agents for people. They rely on us for our services. At the very beginning, we talked about this text message campaign that was going to a lot of Ukrainian national citizens and saying, hey, ATMs are down. That was happening at the same time that a lot of folks were trying to leave the country. They were trying to take on refugee status. Now they couldn't get to their money. Now they have lost confidence in civil society. They're panicking. They don't know what to do, which was very likely the intention behind that text message campaign, right? Real lives, this is what this is impacting. So that, it's not just about protecting the organization. The goal that we have to keep in mind as defenders is much bigger than that. So we'll be around for a while with questions if anybody has any, but thank you for coming.
Thank you very much. And we'd be happy to take any questions. There's a microphone up here as well.
Sorry. What kind of structured analytic techniques are you guys using in your analysis on average?
Great question. We called that out really briefly, and we could have spent an entire hour on that. And the answer would range really depending on the situation. So let's say that someone is just trying to put out a fresh assessment on some new emerging situation. It might look like just saying, hey, is this judgment in the right format that is the standard for our organization? Does it have clear explanation of what's the information underlying, what are the information gaps, and the response looks like a quick paragraph of output. Whereas on kind of the other end of the spectrum, something that a team might do to tee up work that ends up supporting a crisis situation in advance could be, say, a report that takes a month about what are the trends that we're seeing in this particular important area and how do we need to think about what the future looks like. And that could involve something much more in-depth, such as analysis of competing hypotheses. So really it's going to be tailored based on, what am I trying to respond to, how much time do I have, and is this more responsive or is this proactive to help me with future situations?
I would say for my team, we really focus on ACH, and it doesn't have to be a long, drawn-out thing, especially in crisis situations. So essentially, pretty much after we do that stand-up call, and we start to think, okay, what do we do next, right? We'll get everybody on a call, and we'll say, all right, what do you think we should do next? What's your hypothesis? Okay, who's got a different idea? All right, let's debate the two together. We kind of do a small group forum to really discuss these things, but try to poke holes in each other, so sort of a devil's advocate. And if you find something that is unpokeable, I guess, that's usually the tactic we try to go forward with.
Hi, Megan Gates from Security Management Magazine. I was just curious, if you could talk a bit about how you sort of define what a crisis is for your organization, especially, considering right now there are obviously lots of opportunities to have a crisis. So kind of if you can walk through that thought process.
Yeah, I'll take that one if that's okay.
Yeah, go for it.
So we intentionally defined it very poorly and very vaguely, and that's because there is no standard definition, there is no one-size-fits-all, right? So for us, it's essentially defined as any threat activity that has the capacity to impact multiple clients that we expect to get client questions on, and because we're a business, anything that we expect to sort of impact the brand. But in reality, the way that happens is somebody will nominate, and this is again coming back to that steering committee sort of build-out. Somebody and anybody in the company can nominate a significant event. Hey, here's what we're seeing. Hey, here's what we're seeing in this region. Hey, this is upcoming. We expect this to impact a lot of customers. Or more often than not, it is the 2 o'clock, hey, InfoSec Twitter is on fire. We're about to get a flood of questions from customers. We need to get ahead of it, right? So once it's nominated, it goes to the steering committee for a vote. It really just needs to be seconded at that. So there has to be 2 members that say, yep, we should spin up on this. Then the steering committee comes together and we do a very quick stand-up call, which is often the most difficult part because they're very busy. But so we make sure that they know that this is usually a drop everything situation, so they have buy-in and they get on the call. And then we come up with that basic strategy. What's our sort of preliminary operations plan? And then they sort of take on that accountability part of it, and then we go start executing. I think that's pretty much,
Yeah.
Did that answer the question?
Yeah, definitely a situation where you want to assume that it could be a lot worse than it looks, assume there could be a lot more concern than you might think, and create the right structures for that to be surfaced.
Hi. So normally threat intel, the output of threat intel is very text-based. Do you have a way of like quantifying threat intel?
Quantifying, for example, the delivery?
Like quantifying, for example, threat actors on like what are their intents and what's the likelihood of them performing something, capabilities, etc.
Yeah. Good question. Would you like that, or would you like me to take that one?
If you can take that one,
Yeah,
I'm still kind of unpacking it.
Yeah. So I think there are a couple ways that you could quantify a couple different levels. You're talking about quantifying the actual threat activity. That's not something that is really a primary focus, I would say, for us in these types of situations, because usually what stakeholders are looking for is kind of what's the bottom line here versus how does this fit on a scale. In the background, as we do intelligence work, we do look, for example, at what's the level of capability for one actor versus another. How can we measure that? What's the level of risk for one type of organization versus another? How can we measure that? And I would say that generally, that's happening in the background in kind of those inputs to the process versus what's the focus when there's a situation going on where people are asking for answers.
And I think I now understand the question, so it took a minute for my brain to catch up. So when we work with clients who are trying to quantify, and essentially I think what you're talking about is quantifying risk for the organization, right? What's the potential impact of one threat group? Where do we focus our efforts? We have limited time and resources. How should we spend them? So we work with them to create sort of risk heat maps, right? So think about like a vertical and a horizontal graph. On one side, you have the likelihood of a threat actor coming after you based on your sector, based on your industry, based on geography, based on ways you've been targeted in the past. And then on the other axis, you have what's the impact? If they were to come after us based on what we know of how they've come after organizations in the past, what they've done, are they doing data exfiltration? Is it more destruction? Is it ransomware? What are they going to do? And then there's a whole sort of body of knowledge tied to that that's all about quantifying risk. How do you turn this into dollars and cents? They look at those immediate effects. They look at the flow-on effects, right? What is the downtime associated with this attack going to cost us? That's a very long answer that requires what I call spooky math and lots of spreadsheets. But we definitely have folks in the organization who focus specifically on that, so we can talk more about that after. I am not that person.
All right. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.